Thank you so much, Christian. And well, if you want any advice on love, we'll have to do that during the break. Now I'll talk about something else. I'll talk about, boy, this sounds depressing, the state of the world, right? Because you know, something extraordinary happened to BBC radio listeners one day in April in 1930. When they sat down at 7:30 in the evening to listen to the radio news, the anchor told them that, good evening, today is Friday, 18th of April, there is no news. And then for 15 minutes they played piano music on the radio because nothing exciting had happened, nothing dramatic had happened in the world that day, so there was no news. Well, I'm not going to play piano music now for 15 minutes because it's fair to say that these are not the times when nothing happens in the world. On the contrary, one of my smartest friends recently told me that recent years have really proved it to him that we do live in a computer simulation. How else to explain it? First, the script writers throw in Donald Trump, the rise of populism and trade wars and nationalism and the storming of the Capitol and QAnon, and then when we get fed up with that, they throw in a global pandemic. And puts half of the world's population in curfew, blocks the borders everywhere. And once we get out of this, they are ready for the final season, going straight to major war and the threat of nuclear annihilation. And he told me that, boy, this has to be scripted by someone. And it's at least easy to become depressed by world events. But depression, as we all know, is merely anger without enthusiasm. And before we fall into that trap of being angry without being enthusiastic, let's count our blessings. Let's count the stuff that went right, even during these few years that I just summarized briefly. And the first of them is that markets have continued to deliver. Capitalism has continued to deliver under terrible circumstances around the world. First they said that, look, in this pandemic, we can't get hold of protective equipment and face masks and stuff like that. We need governments to organize that. And that's true if you look at what happened in Europe at that time. In the first month of the pandemic, trade with personal protective equipment dropped by 24% within Europe. But why was that? That was because major governments like France and Germany banned the exports of protective equipment. That was because borders were blocked and every government was hoarding everything for itself. What saved us? It was the fact that during that same month, imports of protective equipment from the rest of the world, from non-European countries, surged by 44%. Trade and supply chains saved us and gave businesses in Europe the time to change production, to tweak manufacturing and starting to produce things that were suddenly high in demand that they had never produced before. We had 12 companies producing face masks in Europe at the beginning of the pandemic. 2 months later, we had 500. And this only worked because it wasn't centralized, because every single company looked at, so which stuff is available for the moment? What can we do? What can we stop doing? What kind of supplies can we get from other places? And what is not available? And the same thing goes for global supply chains now as well. We talk about strained supply chains, that the trade is not delivering, capitalism has failed us. Is that really what has happened? In a period when they were short of staff, people weren't allowed to go to work. They weren't allowed to cross borders. We saw shutdowns of ports and trade everywhere. And yet, supply chains continue to deliver. You might remember the first few weeks when some of us began to hoard canned food and toilet paper because we thought that if the world shuts down, everything will be in short supply. But we are embarrassed by that now because it only took a matter of days before businesses looked at what's available, what can we stop doing, what can we do instead, how can we tweak manufacturing, replace inputs with other inputs, and reroute countries that had blocked their borders, and continue to deliver and supply our stores again. We did not face those shortages. In fact, capitalism rebuilt global supply chains in real time. While the plane was flying, it was rebuilt. It was an astonishing accomplishment. And today, now that we're seeing some shortages in some places, it takes a lot of time for your packages to be delivered. Why is that? Is that because they suddenly stopped delivering, suddenly stopped producing? No, it's because we're trying to put more goods than ever before through supply chains that are constantly being hurt by port closures, lockdowns, regulations, and barriers. At the start of this year, we had 6% more goods crossing our oceans than we had before the pandemic. In Sweden, a quarter more. In the United States, even more goods than that was being imported through ports that were non-automated, heavily unionized, and didn't work around the clock. And yet, supply chains continue to produce. What is happening right now is not the breakdown of free trade and supply chains. It's, as someone put it very figuratively, it's like putting a pig through a python. Have you ever seen a python snake swallowing a pig? You know, the pig is big, and this python is long. It takes a lot of time, and it looks disgusting. But in the end, it gets there, because the python is remarkably efficient. And that is what free markets are as well. Remarkably efficient, like pythons swallowing pigs. Okay, let's skip that metaphor and go with another one. It makes me think of Henry David Thoreau, the great transcendentalist writer and thinker and poet and inventor of pencils as well, who said 150 years ago, trade and commerce seems to be made of rubber because they manage to bounce over obstacles which legislators are continually putting in their way. That's the first of our blessings to count, that trade and commerce are made of rubber. And that's why we are still being fed, even though half of the world's population lived under curfews, and capitalism was almost destroyed by politics. Now, of course, it's getting even worse with China's recent lockdowns, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We'll see severe food shortages all over the world. But again, that means that it's war and statism that is ruining our planets, not markets and supply chains. They will continue to rebuild that plane while it's in flight, and that's why we'll see less of a disaster than we otherwise would have. Markets have been put through one of the most severe stress tests of all time, and they've triumphed. And despite the increase in extreme poverty after the pandemic, during the pandemic, in total, extreme poverty over the past decade around the world declined by an average of 82,000 people every day, including the pandemic era. 82,000 people a day in a century. That is so remarkable that people should really begin to appreciate the word capitalism and not reject it. Today, poverty in South Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America is lower than it was in Western Europe in the 1960s, when we thought we were on top of the world. That's how much markets are delivering. And this is my case for optimism. Being hopeful about the world does not mean that we won't see nasty surprises thrown our way. It doesn't mean that we won't see horrors and problems. Being optimistic and hopeful is to recognize that people, when free, are remarkably good at facing the problems, disasters, and horrors that are bound to occur, and at coming up with innovative solutions. However, they are not always free, as we all know too well. Recently, Western governments have overreached, as we talked about at this conference, went too far generally in big government, but specifically with lockdowns and controls and border closures and trade restrictions and trade wars. And then when that created major problems, they tried to ignore the problems rather than dealing with them by serving a free lunch, by lowering interest rates to a rate that's lower than at any point since ancient Mesopotamia, apparently, according to Bank of England. So at least in 5,000 years, we haven't had interest rates at that low level as we had a couple of weeks ago, which, if you believe in any kind of reversion to the mean, it means that they'll probably go up at some point. And on top of this, throwing central bank liquidity into the system like drunken sailors, and then massive stimulus packages and checks and subsidies on everything. Someone calculated that almost $20 trillion have been thrown into the global economy in the past 3 years alone, which means that we've thrown an extra United States of fiat money into the system. That's bound to end up somewhere and result in inflation and therefore eventually interest rate hikes. It's as Lord Macaulay, the great Whig essayist, put it in 1848. They, and he thought of the socialists of his time, they are refuting the doctrines of political economy in the way a man would refute the doctrine of gravitation by jumping off a monument. And that's where we are. We've just jumped off and we're now seeing the ground approaching. At first we saw it in asset inflation, now we're seeing it in inflation everywhere, to their complete surprise. And now they have no idea what's happening and why we have to cut this great boom short with interest rate hikes. And that's the key to what's going to happen next. They are not happy about it. No one is happy about what is going on right now. I recently read an incredibly illuminating interview where Ezra Klein in New York Times interviewed Larry Summers. And the interesting thing is not Larry Summers' answers. It's the fact that Ezra Klein goes off on a stream of consciousness during one of his questions and really reveals what he thinks about the state of the world. And excuse me for quoting this extensively, but it's important. He said, "You know, a lot of things, Larry, get framed as excess demand. But they are things that feel just that many of us have wanted for a long time. More wage increases, stimulus checks for people who've had bad years, didn't have a lot of cushion behind them, child tax credit for families that could really use that, lots of stimulus. There was a reason to run the economy hot. It felt finally like we were reaching people on the margins. We were putting a lot of firepower to do that. And then for that to then turn into this horrifying inflation problem, which is now eating back those wage increases, potentially going to require much sharper action from the Fed. I recognize the world doesn't have to please me." Yeah, he does. But it is maddening. I think one of the hard questions is, does it have to be this way? Did it have to happen like this? Is there some way for this to end without the people we were finally helping suffering? End of quote. And that's the revealing part. The world doesn't please them, and it's maddening. They're starting to realize that the ground is rapidly approaching and something has gone wrong. And that tells you something about the kind of moment that we're approaching. Sooner or later, they're going to have to look at other kinds of solutions to the mess that they have been creating. And that definitely goes not just for Western governments, it goes for the despots of the world as well. We've had a nasty 2022, but the authoritarians of the world, they're in a much, much worse shape in every way. We don't even have to talk about Putin, he might be destroying Ukraine, but he's definitely destroying Russia. And in a very self-destructive manner, destroying everything that he's built up, partly because he got high on his own supply, without any kind of division of powers, without any kind of free speech in society. He might even have believed that this was sort of a quick win to make him more popular in the longer run. But I think even more momentous is what goes on in that other great authoritarian power, China. Xi Jinping is trying to get this third term as China's leader at the end of the year, and he was running on 3 great triumphs where he could prove to anyone that he's been a great helmsman. It was his handling of the economy, It was his handling of zero COVID, and it was his ability to build non-Western alliances, specifically with Vladimir Putin, this great favorite of everybody. He thought it smart at the time to run on those three things. Now it's all in ruins. The economy is rapidly entering negative territory, not just because of the zero COVID policy, but also because this massive stimulus that has been going on since 2008 in China has destroyed so much wealth and built so many weird bubbles that are going to pop, that are popping right now. And entrepreneurs are being destroyed in the sectors where they could have been successful, specifically in tech. And the zero COVID strategy, combined with a ban on Western vaccines that actually work, is a nightmare for its citizens and the economy, and ends up with hundreds of millions of people in curfew, not allowed to meet their relatives, not allowed to go out and get food. And yes, that note with Vladimir Putin. It looks bad for both Putin and Xi. They entered this year on a high note and best friends forever, and they were going to run the world next. Well, now they are terrified of being ousted or killed by their closest men in power. That tells you something about the reversal that is being going on. Because you can do those things in a short period of time. You can mobilize resources in the way where you point everybody in a certain direction. But once in a while, if you're limited to the knowledge of one individual or a tiny group, you're bound to point people in the wrong direction at some point or another. And then it's over the cliff. And that's what happens for the world's dictators. And that doesn't make them less dangerous. Declining powers can lash out, as we all know, but it means that their model is much less tempting, much less, offers much less to the world than it did just a couple of months ago. And that's important, because for the past few years, the Western world has suffered from what I would call dictator envy. We've been longing for a dictator, a Putin. Back here, it was not just Zemmour or Putin who admired the strong men of the world. Everybody did. They thought that, yes, active industrial policy like China, or getting to zero COVID like China, that would be the ideal. We need strong men like that back home. And Thomas Friedman in New York Times, he even dreamt of being China for a day, because then he could solve global warming without this petty bickering between different political parties. Well, now we know what happens when they mobilize whole societies over the cliff. And that doesn't look as great as it once did. I don't know, but to me, this looks like an excellent opportunity for all of us in our whole movement. That tells me that I'm out of time, so I'll just try to wrap up. It seems like a great moment for us in our movement to point to the problems of centralized models, the dangers of executive power and the risk that emergency powers are abused there and here, that centralization is just a way of cutting ourselves off from the ideas, from the knowledge, and from the creativity of millions, and replacing it with a few people at the top, be it despots or be it democratic parliaments. There's been a lot of talk of the 1970s recently, and it sounds a little bit like a rerun. Aggressive but failing authoritarian powers, a new Cold War, threat of nuclear war, government overreach, energy crisis, inflation, hour-long queues at Arlanda Airport, which you will all notice tomorrow or the day after when you're trying to leave Sweden. You might have to stay here a bit longer, I'm afraid. It does all look a bit like the 1970s. But you know what came after the 1970s? The 1980s. And suddenly a dramatic political shift with individual politicians like Thatcher and Reagan, but that had been preceded by ideas, by analysis, by intellectual resources over the past decades that made it possible once that old model ran off a cliff. Milton and Rose Friedman once wrote an essay called The Tide in the Affairs of Men, which tried to sketch their theory of history, where they said that often change starts with a reaction to the status quo, because promises are utopian, but performance is not. And then it takes intellectual independence and courage for some people to start a counter current. And they work in the background for a long time, preparing the ground, preparing proposals that might come in handy at a point when others realize that something has to change. And once real trouble set in, it's easier for people to change their minds. You don't have to be as intellectual adventurous as people in this crowd and jump on the bandwagon, or as Will Rogers put it more figuratively, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. Ideas, Milton and Rose pointed out, play an important part, but not really by making people change their minds. Just like that. You might have noticed that that's difficult. But ideas played a significant part by keeping options open, providing alternative policies to adopt when changes have to be made. When even those who proposed the proposals in the first time say, it looks like we've fallen off a monument and we're approaching the ground. What should we do now? We are in the 1970s right now. We're already a very long way away from the utopian promises and the ideas of a free lunch. We're rapidly approaching the whoops moment, I think, perhaps even the ouch moment. And when that happens, the tide is going to change. And that's our role right now. For all of you gathered here with intellectual independence and courage to start this counter current, to prepare it, because the moment is approaching, to critically examine the status quo and to make a convincing case for why it has failed us, to develop reform proposals for alternative policies when changes inevitably had to be done, so that we'll see the right changes and not the ones that would make everything worse. And you are the ones to do it. The invisible hand needs a little helping hand right now, and you'll find it right at the end of your arm. That's your task after these few days. So again, depression is anger without enthusiasm. So please, let's get angry with a little bit of enthusiasm the next time around and do something about this. Go out and get them. Thank you very much.